In this video, we are exploring how CAT4 data can help schools differentiate with their EAL learners and plan the most appropriate support and interventions for different EAL needs. Here, Gary Webster discusses his school's approach to using CAT4 data with EAL students.
We need to make sure that we understand the difference between those students that are EAL, which is 95% of our cohort, and those students for whom EAL is an issue. And one of the things that the CAT4 data tells us is that a student may have an EAL issue, but actually by looking at all of the other figures that the CAT4 gives us, we are able to determine whether that student is a very, very gifted and talented student who is language limited, or whether that student has a much deeper range of needs that we would need to give extra support to through the use of our EAL department, support in lessons and so on. So the CAT4 data is essential for us in determining those students that are very talented but have an EAL need, and those students that have a much greater range of issues.
For all students in schools, language is key to all aspects of their academic work. To develop socially and academically, and to learn well, students must listen, speak, read and write, and the demands on language increase as children progress through school. Learning an additional language is a long-term process, and with learning the English language, knowledge and skills required for academic work is particularly challenging. For a vast majority of EAL students in our schools, the learning of English begins after they have learnt to use their first language at age-appropriate levels. There is the possibility that some of these students are hard to spot. The consequences for the learner in this case is not good, and here Matthew Savage discusses one such instance.
One is the story of a student who I tested with the CAT4 when they were almost at the end of their academic journey. So they were about to leave the school. I had been told a lot of things about this student, that they were weak, that they had very little academic potential, that they'd been very disaffected and switched off during their learning journey, and that really we shouldn't expect too much of them. And then, when they sat the CAT4, they came out with a score of 141 for spatial, 141 for non-verbal and 140 for quantitative. And I think their verbal was around 80. And it made me really sad, and it made me really angry, because we had there a child who'd been failed by the system. And I don't blame my school for this. Schools around the world are failing kids like that, because if you don't know, how can you do something about it? Now, for that particular child, it was too late. There was nothing that could be done about it. His life chances had, to some degree, already been determined by an education that was based on an insufficient knowledge of that child's needs and strengths.
A supportive educational and social environment is clearly important for pupils learning English as an additional language, and this is being provided by so many schools. By the time EAL students get to GCSE level, the attainment gap between EAL students and those with English as a first language is below 3%. Considering this figure includes all EAL students, including those arriving into secondary education with very little or no English at all, it appears that schools are adapting well, and they are doing so quickly. To support EAL students successfully, teachers need to build as good a picture as they can of ability, strengths, weaknesses, attitudes. Schools use a mix of formal and informal strategies to do this for each student, including gathering information on prior education and level of English. Here, Gary Webster discusses his school's approach to supporting 3 particular students.
Last year, 3 Chinese students joined our school, and they were very language limited. They had almost no English at all. And one of the first things that we do for all students joining us is to do the CAT4 tests with them. What the data showed us was that actually we had 3 very, very talented students in science, technology and math subjects, but obviously that their language was an issue. So what we did was give them some very subject-specific support through the EAL department. That meant that classroom assistants would work with them in other lessons, that they would be withdrawn from some lessons to go and work on subject-specific language needs like biology and mathematical language that would help them to make the maximum level of progress in those subjects. Without that CAT4 data, we would not necessarily have known that they had that potential because their language was such a severe limitation on what they were able to do in the classroom. So the CAT4 data was absolutely essential in spotting that those students were actually very, very talented and enabled us to put together a program of support that means that they are really, really flying in those subjects where language is less of an issue, such as the science, technology and math subjects.
When it comes to using more formal assessments to build a whole school or year group profile, schools tend to use the same assessments for all students. Here, Matthew Savage discusses how building this picture using CAT4 is incredibly important.
Without the CAT4 data, I may see an EAL student purely through their language. And I think for decades, without this sort of rich data, that's exactly what teachers have done. And you then risk a dumbing down. You risk an underestimation of a child's potential. You risk a condescension where you play down to the lowest level possible. Once you know that that child has, for instance, a very high conceptual score, a very high non-verbal aptitude, then it raises the bar. It forces you to challenge that child and to expect so much more of that child. At our school, we believe very much in a growth mindset, very much like Dweck would also champion. And knowing that children's non-verbal scores are as high as they are enables us to accept nothing but the very best from those children.
Using standardised assessments with students with EAL does require careful preparation and an approach that recognises that initial assessment data may not reflect current or future performance or ability. Assessing on a one-off basis will provide teachers with a snapshot. However, assessment really comes into its own when it is done on a regular and systematic basis. This is the case with all students, but perhaps even more so with those who have English as an additional language, because teachers should be able to see clearly the improvement in a student's verbal profile or reading attainment over time. Where this can't be seen, there may be a deficit in language generally, meaning in the student's first language, and that needs investigating. I have been speaking with schools recently about their policy and practice, and it is clear that assessing all students as a cohort is very important. With an assessment like CAT4, the parts that are not language dependent can offer really rich information. That can help not only place a student in a suitable teaching group, but also influence how English is taught and supported. Here we can see an example developed by Matthew Savage, showing the key CAT4 data for a group of students. We can see we have 9 students with their CAT scores, including their verbal score, quantitative score, non-verbal score and spatial score, together with their mean score. Looking at the group's mean standard age score, we can see student I is showing the strongest cognitive ability, while student C is clearly showing the weakest. However, looking at the mean standard age score alone can potentially hide some important information about these students. For example, if we look at student F, his mean standard age score is 104, a score slightly above the average, and we might consider this student to be on track and not to investigate further. However, we can see that Matthew has added a calculation to help distinguish students where EAL might be flagged. This is calculated by subtracting the student's non-verbal score from their verbal score. This calculation has flagged a number of students where there is a discrepancy. Most significantly, we see student F. His verbal score is 99, his non-verbal score is 122, and therefore his verbal deficit is -23. This may be indicative of an EAL student drawing on their first language skills to solve the tasks in the non-verbal test. However, this is a flag demanding further investigation and specific intervention for this student to help him bridge the gap between his verbal score and his non-verbal score, as this verbal deficit is highly likely to be impeding his progress. One particular school told me of a student with almost no English, but whose CAT4 scores for non-verbal, spatial and quantitative were very high, all over 135. The student was placed in top sets for teaching, and within a year his English had developed to an extent that he could access the curriculum and begin to achieve at the level his other test scores indicated. Knowing his very high ability was a real benefit in supporting this student in his language learning. Here, Philip Walters discusses how CAT4 has helped to highlight specific students and the implications for teaching and learning.
CAT4 is really useful for either backing up what you think you know or highlighting certain students. And for English as a second language, when the verbal score, the verbal reasoning score, is significantly lower than the non-verbal reasoning score, significantly, we take it to be about 15 or 20 points lower, then we would investigate. Maybe we know already because they're on our EAL register, but maybe, and sometimes we do an extra EAL test, perhaps on entry they appeared very confident and we might need to go and revisit. Sometimes then we would invite them to after-school clubs for further confidence in their English, or for working towards PET or whatever is necessary. But it allows a further investigation into that child, if we haven't already done it.
If, alongside CAT, a student's verbal reasoning in his or her first language can be assessed, that can be helpful. However, this can be very difficult, as the tradition of standardised tests like CAT is not widespread. Schools with EAL students very often choose to reassess with CAT, for example every 2 years, and through this gain a much more accurate profile, including for more developed language skills. The indicators from CAT will also be more accurate. Using the new group reading test alongside CAT will offer a measure of reading and comprehension, and used year on year as English language acquisition increases, can accurately reflect levels of reading. Because NGRT is adaptive, it offers a very appropriate way of assessing reading in students who are still learning English. The age equivalent score, or reading age from NGRT, can be especially helpful. Another school I spoke to chose to begin assessing their primary children using the British Picture Vocabulary Test. This is very appropriate to young children, as it is picture-based and involves no reading or speaking. The child can point to their answer choice. The BPVS provided a secure baseline from which the school could implement a thorough language support programme that has brought real improvements to attainment. Now, a broader range of standardised assessments can be used, for example, the York Assessment of Reading for Comprehension. As a final point, it is probably worth mentioning that additional language learning takes time, but perhaps not as long as is generally assumed. As explained by Constance Young, Professor of Educational Linguistics at King's College London, students in school environments that are supportive of EAL development tend to take approximately 18 months or so to develop a reasonable level of spoken fluency for everyday purposes, and 5 or more years to develop peer-level academic English competence. Here Matthew Savage discusses how a student with EAL with high ability was spotted early using CAT4.
We have another child in our current Year 9, so they would be about 14 years old, who first sat the CATs when they were 11. And the CATs showed a very similar picture to the other student. But when the child is 11 or 12 years old, you can do something about it. So we ensured that that child, for instance, was put into the top set for English. Even though their verbal aptitude was very, very low, they were put into the top set for English, so that they were exposed to higher level language and high level thinking from the outset. They were told the whole time how much potential they had. All the time they were stretched and they were pushed. And the expectations of them were exceptionally high. And quickly the expectations of them from their peers were also exceptionally high. And what we've seen is a scarily dramatic acceleration of their English acquisition, and now they are, one of the top in the year group, and they will go on to great things.